So welcome everybody. My name is Sean Murphy, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the life and times of St. Patrick, possibly the most famous person associated with Ireland. And as you will see as we go through this, he wasn't Irish himself, but that is neither here nor there. So I'm going to be showing you this on a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll be going to the slides in a couple of minutes. So I'll be progressing, through a little bit about his personal history, his family history, his mission to Ireland, the work he did in Ireland, all the time trying to keep you informed about the major geopolitical events, if you like, that were happening that are the background to his mission in Ireland. Events like the decline of the Roman Empire, the rise of Christianity, the huge migrations in Europe at the beginning of the 5th century. This is essentially a summary of a 4-week course that I'll be giving in March, and I'll be giving details of that on the final slide. So with that being said, I'm going to move on into the presentation. So I'm going to screen share with you now. So here's a quote from Patrick himself. He didn't write in English, obviously. There was no English language as we know it today at the time. He wrote in Irish and he wrote in Latin. And this is a translation from one of the 2 writings that we have from him. And it begins with, I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated, and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many. That might surprise you if you had no previous knowledge of St. Patrick, because the image that everybody has is of this person who was very, very successful and who must have had wondrous talents and whatever. But as I'll show you as we go through, he had his issues and problems with authorities at the time. So I'm going to begin with him and his family. His name wasn't Patrick. His name was Maewyn Succat. He got the additional name Patricios, from which Patrick comes from. Some say he got that name at the time that he was ordained, but we're not sure. He came from a Romano-British Christian missionary family that was living on the west coast of Britain, or at least most people believe that and agree to that. There are some people who claim that he may have come from the continent. He's known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he's the primary patron saint, along with Saints Bridget and Saint Columkill, or Saint Columba. He was born around 385, probably in Kilpatrick, near Dumbarton in Scotland. Other people say it was Wales. In his writings, he identifies his village as Banaventa Bernia, but no one has been able to track that down. Others claim that he came from the Christianized areas of Gaul, of Western Europe. His parents were Calpurnius and Conchessa. They were wealthy Romano-British living in Britain, in charge of the colonies, because the Romans had colonized Britain from around the middle of the 1st century, and they had displaced and taken over from the early British people, mainly Celts. Calpurnius, his father, was a deacon, and his grandfather was a priest. There is evidence from his writings and from other writings that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland. We know of Saint Mel of Ardagh and brothers Melchu, Munis, and Rioch. They were brothers of Saint Mel. They all accompanied their uncle Patrick to Ireland. The most famous of his family was Dorerca, and she was a sister of St. Patrick. She's known in Ireland as the Mother of Saints because of her children. She had 17 sons and 2 daughters. All entered the religious life, and many were later recognized as saints. Several of her sons became bishops. She's honoured in Ireland today on the 22nd of March, and she's the patroness of Valentia Island off the coast of County Kerry. Saint Mel, he helped evangelize Ireland, and in the spirit of a lot of the early Christians who did not believe in being supported, he supported himself through manual labour. Patrick appointed him as one of the earliest Irish bishops and head of the Diocese of Armagh. And then Mel also went on to help and get the monastery of Ardagh built. And he was both bishop and abbot there. One of the most, I suppose, important elements of his life was that it is generally accepted, was the one who accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun, and he served as her mentor while she was in Ardagh. Again, at that time, even though under ancient Celtic society, women had a status that they didn't have for much longer after Christianity came to Ireland, when they were seen as subservient. But St. Bridget was an exception to that. Now, to get into the church and to be a working member of the church, you had to be accepted, and somebody had to take you in and be a mentor. And it was St. Mel who did that. There were lots of other people who could have done it, but they refused. St. Mel has a feast day, February the 7th, coming up pretty soon, and it's observed as a holiday for single people, a day for singles to celebrate the good things about being single. Traditions include sending yourself a St. Mel's Day card, as well as hosting parties for your single friends. So let's have a look then at the early life of Patrick. And how do we know about his early life? Well, he wrote about it. And there's a letter which we now know and call it as the Confessio, not because he called it the Confessio, but somebody at some point decided to give it that name because he finished up the document basically saying it was his last confession. He came to Ireland at 16, probably in the year 403 AD, and given you the generally accepted timeline, there are people who disagree with this timeline. He was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain, as well as thousands of other people at the time, and he was sent to Ireland to serve as a slave herding and tending sheep in Dalriada. The issue here was that the Ireland was never overtaken by the Romans. It was never colonized by the Romans. And one of the reasons for that was the success that the Irish had in terms of their military strategy. So they decided the best way to prevent the Romans ever attempting an invasion of Ireland was to continually harass them from what is now Scotland. And that's what they did successfully. Now, one of the things that they did to destabilize the west coast of Britain was to raid and to take people as slaves and to destroy the settlements. So he was caught up in that. So when his area was attacked, he was taken as a slave. He was owned by a rí, which is the Irish word for king. He was a small local king, Miliach MacBain, and he ruled some hills of Antrim between Lough Neagh and Slieve Mish. We are told, or he tells us himself in the Confessio, that he began to pray, as you might if you were a young person and you ended up on the mountains in Ireland and had no future really unless you could get out of that. So he began to pray, and in the writings he tells us that he had never before paid much attention to the teachings of his religion, even though his family were deeply imbued with religion and members of various religious orders. He tells us that he did not really believe in God and that he found priests foolish. That's where he was. In Slemish, it means Slemish Mountain, and it's a mountain in County Antrim. And the tradition is that that's where Patrick was. It's the first known home that he was in. And he worked there as a shepherd from the ages of 16 to 22. 16 to 22, as today, would be primary years in your adult education, your high school and your college, university. And even though we're talking about the best part of 1600 years ago, if you were a member of the elites, you got the best of education. You went to college. You were expected to go. And if you wanted to be part of the church and you wanted to move up the hierarchy within the church, you had to have a really good education. because he was a slave here in Ireland. He missed out on that, and that was going to be a problem for him for the rest of his life. So for 6 years, and as any of you who are Irish, you will know that there was a lot of cold and damp weather and isolation. He would have been twinned with another person, because the only way that you could ensure that you didn't run away was that you were twinned in a way that if one of you decided to make a run for it, the other person was going to have a horrendous time. And it was one of the reasons why either they both tried to flee together, or and there doesn't seem to have been a lot of that. Well, we know very little, about that, but we can assume certain things, that there would have been some help, because at the time there was a lot of slaves in Ireland, and most of them were slaves that had been kidnapped. Some people who were kidnapped would have been freed on the payment of ransom, but a lot of people would not have been in that category. And in some cases, ransom wasn't accepted. They wanted the people because they were more valuable. So he tells us that on his last night, he received in his sleep his first, what he describes as, or has been described as, an otherworldly experience. A mysterious voice saying to him, "Your hungers are rewarded. You are going home." Today we would probably say that he was suffering from homesickness. And as anybody who has ever suffered from homesickness, you can have the most vivid dreams. So that's probably all that was involved in this. We know that he had to walk 200 miles to the southeast coast of Ireland, or roughly that. What was interesting is that he wasn't apparently stopped, and he doesn't mention anything about ever being stopped or approached, which would have been an almost impossible achievement. His explanation is that he says, "I came in God's strength and had nothing to fear." It's more likely that he was supported by what we would call today an underground railroad that was supporting slaves who were trying to leave. But it was very difficult, to get off an island. But again, it is likely that there was a supportive network. While he was in Ireland, he became fluent in the Irish language. He learned of Irish culture and history, and apparently developed an affinity to the people, so much so that he wanted to come back. And that's one of the reasons why he did come back. When he got to the coast, he found a boat there that was loading up a cargo of Irish hounds that were going to the continent, probably to Rome. Irish wolfhounds and various other hounds were in great demand, particularly in Rome. He approached the captain. He was turned away because, again, for a captain of a ship to take a slave, there were severe penalties for that. He also approached the sailors, and his work is that he went away. His word is that he went away and said a few prayers, and then for some magical and mystical reason, there was he heard the sailors shouting to him to come on board. "We'll take you in trust." So anyway, he did get on board, and he traveled for 3 days. And when they got to where they were going, what they found was devastation. The reason for that was, at this time, there was huge issues within Europe, and what you had was millions of Germanic peoples being forced into Western Europe as the Huns advanced on them. There were also a lot of them who were heading because they wanted to take over Rome. Rome was constantly under attack from Germanic peoples. The problem, or the issue here, was that Western Europe had been Christianized and was under Roman control. So the incoming Germans were pagans and were very much anti-Roman. So the destruction that they carried on left the place devastated, and that's why he describes it as being devastated. Apparently they walked for about 2 weeks, couldn't find anything to eat, as every animal and every crop, essentially what happened was the people who came through took everything. So they began to taunt him, and they said to him, "How about it, Christian? You say your God is all powerful." And he says anyway that what he did was he turned to them and he said, "From the bottom of your heart, turn trustingly to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible." Apparently, what he says anyway, the sailors bowed their head, and just then they heard a stampede of a herd of pigs. which were probably in the area anyway. They didn't just suddenly arrive. So they had a feed, and he, at some point, and we don't know, but at some point he separated from the others who continued with their hounds. Because remember, those hounds were very valuable, and there was no way that they were going to, no matter how hungry they got, there was no way that they were going to start killing the hounds for their own survival. Now, I've got an interesting story here about the island of Lerins. You probably heard the old fable that Patrick got rid of snakes from Ireland. Well, it's a lie. He didn't. What may have happened is what I'm going to tell you now. So after he left the people with the hounds, he had to try to get back. He wanted to get back to his family. And there was no point going back the way he came because there was nothing there. So he probably decided to go around the coast. And around the year 410, which would correspond to the timeline of Patrick, there was an abbot Honoratus, and he was constructing a monastery on the island of Lerins, which is near modern-day Cannes. It had been uninhabited and was full of snakes. So they were looking for people to come and work and to help build the monastery, but also to do the initial work, which was getting rid of these snakes and vipers and whatever else that was there. In a book that's written about the island of Lerins, we learned that Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. Now, he was getting the reputation, other people were doing the work. Probably one of those was Patrick, and she writes that it's not impossible or unreasonable to assume that he, Patrick, might have sought refuge on Lerins. My guess is that in later years, when he was in Ireland and they were sitting down after a day's work, Patrick was probably either boasting about his work of driving snakes on that island into the sea or whatever, and as we know, tall stories become even taller. Anyway, so he was back home, and in the Confessio then he says, a few years later I was again with my parents in Britain. They welcomed me as a son, and they pleaded with me that after all the tribulations I had had, I should never leave them again. At this stage, partly because of his praying in Ireland, he began to consider that his future should be in the church, and it looks like he considered that the only way he was ever going to be able to get back to work among the Irish would be as a member of the church. Again, he began hearing voices, and he tells us about this in his work, and this is the way he puts it. Now, granted, we're looking at a translation. I have never seen the original, and sometimes things are lost in translation. Also, the way people spoke at the time may not be exactly the way we would express it, today. So, what he said was, I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus. Apparently, he'd known this person when he was a slave in Ireland, and he carried many letters, and he gave me one of them. I read the heading, The Voice of the Irish, and as I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Fauclute, which is beside the western sea, and they cried out as with one voice, we appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us. Now, what's quite likely is that he was trying to explain why he was interested in going to Ireland, and probably being a little bit liberal with the truth and coming up with a story. But that's what we have. So I'm going to go into and explain to you a little bit about the history of Ireland and Christianity. Again, the old myth was that Patrick was the one who brought Christianity to Ireland, but that's not true. The Christian church had been established in Ireland, possibly since the 1st century AD. It is said that St. James visited Ireland in the 1st century, and when he left behind an organization to spread the religion. Early Irish Christianity was from the teachings of St. John, who spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. And then the issue was that many of the practices of St. John differed from that of other saints like Peter and Paul and the other Roman-based disciples. In the early centuries, there were anything up to 7 and 7+ different religious communities, all who differed on all sorts of issues, practices, liturgy. Um, but the one that influenced Ireland the most was St. James, um, and probably because of the historical antagonism between the Celts and the Romans, there would have been a deep suspicion of anything coming directly from Rome. There are other things that we know from Irish legends and annals. The first one is the death of the High King, Cormac MacNessa, who was alive at the time of Jesus. And the story is that upon hearing from one of his commanders, who apparently was in Calvary on the day, because apparently at the crucifixion it was decided that they would have a representative of every nation on the earth there. And the representative from Ireland, who was a prisoner at the time of the Romans, was a commander of Cormac MacNessa. The Irish would have been fighting all over Europe, generally against the Romans, but you know, there were mercenary soldiers from Ireland who fought with the Romans as well. So he related the story to Cormac MacNessa about the death, and he was so infuriated by that he got up and he started ranting and raving and ran out. Problem was, Cormac in some battle had got a piece of shrapnel in his brain, and with this ranting and raving and jumping about, the piece of shrapnel became loose and he died from a hemorrhage. The next thing we have from our own history is that in the year 366, probably the greatest of the High Kings, Cormac MacArt, died, and he's said to have converted to Christianity. But the Druids at the time, who were the leaders of the pagan religion in Ireland, were not happy about that, and they apparently killed them. We're not too sure whether they poisoned them. There's different stories about what happened. Now, also, before St. Patrick arrived in Ireland, there were a number of other Irish Christian leaders there. We know them by name: Albie, Declan, Kieran, Ibarus. All of them were later elevated as saints. Some of the early Irish Christian development is explained by the relationship of Ireland to the Roman Empire. And as I said, Ireland had been fighting against the Roman Empire. They had formed alliances in northern Britain, Gaul, and North Africa, and fought against them. And as I said, one of the issues that would have arisen there is that they would have been deeply suspicious of adopting something that came directly from Rome. Now, for the first 3 centuries, the Catholic, the church, the Christian church, because it wasn't called Catholic at this time, the Christian church was being persecuted, and it ended when Constantine became emperor of Rome. Now, in his battles to become emperor, because he was based in Britain in the years, and then he decided that he wanted to become emperor, and to do that he had to fight for it. To fight for it, he had to recruit soldiers and get them to fight. Now, because he was in Britain, Britain at this time was Christian. The country that he would have to go to when he hit the continent, Gaul, was Christian. So it appears that he had to do a deal with the Christians to get them to fight. And that deal was, we will fight for you, provided, if we win, that you will stop the persecution of Christians. And that's what happened. Constantine won the battle, and within a few years he legislated. That process, continued, and by the end of that century, Christianity was made the one and only official religion of the Roman Empire by the Emperor Theodosius, who also was the one who used the word, Catholic. So that's where we get the Roman Catholic Church from. As I said, he was born in Britain, and because of the Roman Empire was under attack in Britain, what happened was that they had to withdraw their soldiers in the year 410. They could no longer leave them there, and that created huge problems for Britain, and it explains why the Romans then got replaced in turn by the Anglo-Saxons, because the Anglo-Saxons were called in initially to England, because they never got really into Scotland. They came to England as a mercenary army, and by the 440s, 450s had decided that they could take it over, and that's what they did. In 476, Odoacer, who was one of the leading Goths, he forced the Roman Empire to abdicate. So in 380 there was an edict of Thessalonica, and that made what was called Nicene Christianity after the famous Nicene convention in the year 325. And as I said, from that time the word Catholic then became associated with that. It meant universal. That then provided the impetus for church leaders to assert their dominance then over the various branches of the church around, around Europe essentially, but also in the Far East and the Near East. Events began to happen then, like in 429, which was a couple of years before Patrick came to Ireland. The Pope sent Saint Germanus to Britain, because at that time in Britain there was a form of Christianity that was oppositional to Rome, and Saint Germanus came to sort that out. He sorted it out in a typical manner. He basically told those who would agree with him that they could stay, and those who didn't, they could leave. And it's quite likely that a lot of those that left would have gone to Ireland. So if we want to look at who were the Christians in Ireland at the time, we know that the vast bulk of the Irish people were pagans, but there were Christians in Ireland. The slaves that came, most of those that came to Ireland from Britain and Gaul, they would have been Christians. It's also possible that some of the Irish mercenary soldiers, both fighting for and against Rome, may have converted while they were away fighting, and may have come back with spouses and families that were Christian. There was a lot of trading going on, so traders may have converted. And then, of course, the work of the early Irish missionaries. Possibly the biggest group, the most important group for the next 4 or 5 centuries, were the refugees and asylum seekers who came at this time. Because as the Germanic tribes raided and took over the Christianized Gaul, those people had to find somewhere to go to, and huge numbers of them came to Ireland, and they brought with them lots of resources and lots of skills. The Irish population grew at this time, and within 2 centuries it had the highest population that it had, and was not surpassed for another 1100 years. So now I'm going to have a look at how Patrick converted the Irish. Here's a couple of quotes from him. He says, "Daily I am expecting to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery." So again, he was worried about whether the Irish would accept him and whether he could get away with his mission. The period was described by Cardinal Cushing in this way. He said, "It was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and disorder and chaos." So all of that is referring to the emergence of the Christian Church, its adoption by the Roman Empire, with the collapse of the Roman Empire. And a lot of people in the Roman Empire and the countries in the Roman Empire, they were blaming Christianity for the fall of the Roman Empire. They were saying that it's no coincidence that the Roman Empire is collapsing, and at the same time we're becoming Christian. So there was a lot of issues going on there. So what was his role? Well, first of all, just before he arrived, a year or so before he arrived, another person had been sent by the Pope, Palladius. That mission failed. Then Patrick was sent to replace them. That's the kind of the main narrative that we have. There are some people who dispute that, but that's the main narrative that we have. Now, what we do know is that his primary role, because he was coming from Rome, his primary role was to come to Ireland and ensure that the Christian community in Ireland aligned with Rome and not with one of the other, what they considered heresies at the time. The word strengthen is used. He was sent in Ireland to strengthen the local Christian community, and by strengthening he meant to strengthen that section that wanted to be aligned with Rome and to try to get everybody else to follow that lead. So the mix then in Ireland of Christians, there were some Irish, there was Christian slaves, Christian refugees, and Christian asylum seekers. And the number must have been substantial, because remember, Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire. And at the time, the kind of overriding, if you like, view was that we're only going to spread the religion into those areas that were under the Roman Empire. So the fact that they decided to come to Ireland must have meant that there was a lot of Christians there. He spent about 20 years because he didn't get to Ireland until he was in his middle to late 40s. So he spent about 20 years preparing after he had managed to get back home and decided what he was going to do. And this is when the missing out of his high school and college education began to be a problem. Because of his lack of formal education, his role was going to be confined as a brother. They were saying you don't have the qualifications to become a priest, and that continued for a long time. Now he convinced them eventually. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but eventually he was made a priest, and then he actually was made a bishop, and he successfully pleaded his case to be sent to Ireland. Some of that may have been due to the difficulty that was expected for anybody going to Ireland, the likelihood that they wouldn't succeed, the likelihood that they would be killed. Added to that then was his open expression of willingness and desire to go there. So that would have all helped them. Also, to go there at the time, because the church at this stage, in trying to deal with the heresies in Britain, in their meetings with the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain, they had to concede that if Rome was going to to do anything with the nearest island, Ireland, that they would have to get approval from the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain. They did not favour the promotion of Patrick, but they somehow were convinced that he should be allowed. But the fact that they weren't happy with it is the background to what happened later when they decided they wanted to remove him, and we'll be looking at that in some time. So again, he didn't come on his own. He had a retinue, and Cardinal Cushing describes his retinue, never less than 24 persons, possibly up to 100. The group included an assistant bishop, a chaplain, several young men that were being prepared for the priesthood, a Brehon or judge to advise him on legal matters, builders, masons, smiths, metalworkers, chariot and wagon drivers, a cook, and of course a brewer, and 2 table attendants. Besides these then, you had the sacristan, 3 embroidery workers to prepare the linens, and a palmist, who would be the custodian of the sacred books. We don't know for sure, but it's possible that he did use some of his family wealth as well as the church wealth. One of the books that has been written by a man called Cahill, he suggested Patrick, because of his knowledge of the Irish language and culture, was sent to provide support. And he did start in Northern Ireland. One of the reasons for that is because the existing missionaries were doing very well in Southern Ireland, and they probably did not want somebody coming in and taking over the work that they were doing. He would have had to get permission from the local kings to minister to Christians in a given area. He would have sought assistance then of local kings, who would then have given him permission to move on and would have interceded on his behalf with their network within the clan system. He did convert some kings and in the early stages, and that did help to make his work easier. So another book about Patrick by Freeman, it suggests that he succeeded by using a slow and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. And that involved what we now know as paying bribes. He calls it, in his own letters, making payments to local kings to gain their favour and protection. And he was a very commonsensical type of person. He knew that that's what you had to do, and he did it. He chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic, because he wanted to demonstrate Christianity. And he wanted to do it in a way that appealed to people. The pagan religion, which was what most of the Irish people adhered to at the time, he understood the importance of that to people, and he understood the need to be able to explain to people even things like what was in common with paganism and the Christian church, things like transcendentalism, the belief in a life hereafter. So he would have focused upon those things that made sense to people. Um, Whatever he did, it appears to have worked. So he recognized the history of the spiritual practices. He understood and accepted the nature-oriented pagan rituals, and a lot of those were incorporated into church practices. One of the ways that we can see that is from what's known as Patrick's Celtic cross, because it combines the native sun worshipping and the Christian elements of both cultures. So let's have a look then at his achievements. He established bishops throughout northern, central, and eastern Ireland. As I said, the south was controlled by other saints or other people who became saints. He structured the church by locating bishops close to the sites of provincial kings. Now, the reason for this was that the Irish society was not willing or ready for a whole new geographical formation of the country. So what happened then was that every one of the smaller kingdoms within Ireland, when they adopted Christianity, they wanted their own Christianity, and they wanted whatever was going to go on to be restricted within their boundaries. And as a result, we had about 150 separate dioceses, if you like, that corresponded with the groups. And unfortunately, over time, the religious and the civic, if you like, became incorporated to the extent that some of the religious orders would have been involved in fighting. Patrick himself became the highest ranking bishop in Ireland, seated at Armagh, and the primacy of Armagh today is it links back to that. The reason it is primary in Ireland is because of its claim to have been formed by St. Patrick. There were attempts by both Cashel and by Dublin to suggest that they had a stronger, more important historical or whatever case to be made. But eventually Armagh was accepted as the primary seat in Ireland. He made Latin the ecclesiastical language of Ireland. One of the things that is often pointed to is that in Ireland there were no church martyrs. Some suggest that indicates that the pagan rulers allowed him to carry out his mission. Again, it may have just been pure good luck that there were no church martyrs. We certainly do know that there were followers of Patrick killed and injured. We do know, and he writes himself, that there was about 12 occasions when he feared that he would be killed himself. And in the Confessio, it reads, "For on more than one occasion Patrick alludes to persecution. He declares that he expects martyrdom, and he welcomes the prospect." Now, in the first 3-4 centuries, a lot of people who were Christians expected martyrdom and invited martyrdom because, like a lot of people today in some religions, they believed that if you were martyred, you went straight to heaven, and you were going to have the highest of stature within that. And we know that from various religions today. People still believe the same thing, but that's what they believed at that time. By the time of his death, he hadn't succeeded in converting the whole of Ireland, and he hadn't reconciled the secular authorities to Christianity. He did support the church officials. He created councils, he founded monasteries, and he organized Ireland into the diocese, but not on the Roman model. We know that in 6th century law, and again this would have been influenced by his earlier work, it laid out a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbours. And it wasn't a code of conduct that says that you have to proselytize and convert them all. There was an acceptance at this time that that was not going to be the case. That if people were going to convert, it wasn't because they were going to be forced into it. It was because you can demonstrate the superiority of this religion. Cardinal Cushing, again, he says that in the 25 years, he claims the whole island was Catholic. Um, we know that that wasn't true, but there's little debate. It's accepted that he would have consecrated about 350 bishops, ordained about 5,000 priests, and built more than 700 churches. So there would have been a massive economic boom in Ireland as a result of all of this activity. And a lot of that would have been funded from the resources that were coming in from the refugees that were fleeing from Gaul. So we'll have a close look now at some of his writings. There were two that are accepted as originating with him, although we don't have the original copies. What we do have are the copies that were made a few centuries after he died. The first one is a letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, Coroticus was a Christian leader on the west coast of Britain. And what Coroticus did was he raided the northeast coast of Ireland, and he raided a community that Patrick had just left. Hours earlier, he had just left, and he had baptized and converted all of the local people. Coroticus came in, and he took the people away as slaves. When word reached Patrick, he decided he had to do something about it. And he also knew that the eyes of the country and the eyes of the people of Ireland were looking at him to see what he would or could do. So what he decided to do was to send a letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. And in the letter was framed so that it was at once it was a decree of excommunication, it was a heartfelt plea, a carefully argued sermon, also a word of comfort to his Irish followers, and a powerful prayer to God for divine justice. Copies were sent not just to Coroticus, but to church leaders in Britain and to fellow Christians in Ireland. Now, the problem with that was protocol at the time would have required him not to intervene directly. It would have required that he go and speak with the church authorities in the area that was controlled by Coroticus. Now, Patrick realized a couple of things. One was that was going to take too much time. He knew he only had a week or two before the people who were kidnapped would be put onto the slave market and would be on their way to anywhere. Could be on their way to China, Far East, all over Europe. So time was pressing. Also, he figured that it was quite likely that the ecclesiastical authorities in that area were dependent for their security on Coroticus. So he decided that he needed to take that kind of unilateral action. Problem was that the church in Britain were horrified that he would intervene in this way and break with protocol. And it appears that it was at this time that they decided that they needed to take him to task and remove him. And the rest of his life then was as a result of his attempt to do something for his enslaved converts. So the Confessio then was the second document, and it comes from the final line of his letter, in which he writes that the letter is his confession before death. He was probably about 72, 73. So why did he write the Confessio? Well, he wrote it because, as I said, the church in Britain were very upset about the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. They had been looking essentially for an opportunity to get at him, because he had refused time and time again to respond to calls from Britain. And essentially the calls from the church in Britain were motivated by their desire to get a share of the money that was coming in, whereas Patrick wanted to use that money to build the church in Ireland, not to be giving it on to Britain. He would have been possibly diverting some of it directly to Rome, but he had no desire to send anything to the church in Britain. So because of the relationship between Rome and Britain, and because the church in England essentially had to agree to his initial placement, they were his immediate superiors, if you like. So they called him back to England for a review. Now, he knew that if he went for that review, he would probably never get back to Ireland, so he refused to go, and he wrote the Confessio. Um, by this stage, his character and work were attacked. He was accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland, was stated to be unfit for the job, was too close to the Irish, and they used this little way of describing him. They described him as a filthy little pig keeper, because he did keep pigs. So the Confessio then, it's the closest what we have to an autobiography. It's a selective story. It was designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish, and then he goes through his boyhood, his slavery, his escape, his dreams, threats, temptations. All these were included to convince the readers that he, like the Apostle Paul, was selected by God and guided by him in his work. And there's a beautiful piece that he writes, and hopefully you'll get the subtlety of what he's writing. So he says, "Listen to me well, all of you, great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners, so proud of your education." They were the ones who were opposed to him initially because he lacked the educational qualifications. So he said, "Listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence. He picked ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forth with fear and reverence, and without any of you complaining at the time, to serve the Irish faithfully." So that's what he wrote in about 460. So he was saying, essentially, the last line refers to the fact that, okay, there were certain formalities. He didn't like the idea that I was being sent, and the reason for that was because you weren't the ones who made the choice. But what he was saying is that you were probably considering I wouldn't last very long over there, that I would die and I'd be gone away. You wouldn't hear from me again. So he was alluding to that. And basically saying, the only interest you have now in me is because of my success, and you want to take that from me. He died at Saul, in a place that's now called Downpatrick. In his day, it wasn't called Downpatrick. It wasn't called Downpatrick for another 800 years. And of course, it was on the 17th of March, and it was where he had built his first church. The Anglo-Normans who came in and renamed the place as Downpatrick, they were the ones who then, in an effort to gain favour with the church, they decided to remember Patrick. So they built a cathedral, and they claim anyway to have gone and got the remains of St. Bridget and St. Columba and put them all together. A variety of dates are given for his death. Again, if you're reading some books, I'm just alerting you to this so that you don't think I'm spinning a yarn on you, but there's different people who believe different things. There's the two Patricks theory, and we're not too sure what, if there's any truth in that, but certainly it's not the story that I've been giving you. In Ireland, the annals say that in 461-62, the annals say that here some record the repose of Patrick. Some books talk about him dying in 492-93 at the age of 120. Now, if you know anything about Scripture and about the Old Testament, if you died at the age of 120, that was like a sacred age, because I think that was the age that Moses died at, or the claim that Moses died at. So there was often an attempt, to allude to things from the Old Testament to heighten or elevate the status of people. So some people believe that the reason that year was done was to elevate him to the status of Moses. Just a postscript. I don't have time to go into more detail, but people know about laughter in Ireland. So what was different in Ireland to the continental church fathers was that the Irish didn't trouble themselves about eradicating pagan influences. They tried to get people to convert by adopting their ways. And Christianity then went on and adopted all of the dates within the year that were important to the Irish, and all of the places that were important. And then, over time, as the pagan evil god shrank in stature, a belief grew strong that the one thing the devil cannot bear is laughter. And that's the reason, if you go around the Irish countryside, you'll see all of these comical gargoyles. Um, and we know that in mythology, it's explained that they were used to ward off evil. That meant that the devil would not, come near them because they were laughing. Um, as I said at the beginning, I teach Irish history classes. So over the next 2 months, these are the classes, and I'm contactable through my email address there, seanmurphy630@gmail.com. So in February, one is the history of the County Derry, which is part of one program that I have, which is to give the history of each county in Ireland, and I'm progressing through all of the counties. The second course that I give is on the Tudor conquest of Ireland, and that's part of the chronological history of Ireland that begins about 400 million years ago and goes right up to the essentially Brexit and the situation in Ireland today. They're all Zoom presentations, and the course, it's a 4-week course, and the fee is $80. Then in March, continuing with the counties, and it's County Cork, and then I'm going to give a 4-week presentation on the life and times of St. Patrick, which goes into a lot more detail than what I was able to give here today. There are movies that are available. If you want to go onto YouTube, I suppose there is a very good movie there. It was made, I think, in 1999. And it's well worth a look at. And then there's some smaller movies that you may be able to track down, and there's also a kids movie, so you may find those interesting. So that's it, folks. I hope you learned something about St. Patrick there, and I tried to give you the historical perspective. As best as we can, because the literary period only began in Ireland around the time of St. Patrick, and so we don't have too many documents that can verify every detail, and there are still disputes. Everything from, there are some people who even want to dispute the very existence of St. Patrick. They say there never was a St. Patrick, that the church in the 6th and 7th centuries manufactured him in a way to present the history of Christianity in Ireland. But there's just too much, as they say, there's a preponderance of evidence to suggest that there was a person who we know as Patrick. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it.